The
called the
broadcast is
IRS.
now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
You will also see that there is an IRS non-filing tax form that is, and instructions. That is just some how-tos on how to complete and how to support students doing the IRS non-filing tax form if they're selected for verification, which we will talk about here in this webinar as well. If you're going, we will be doing a Q&A panel of question and answers. If you have a question, you can go ahead and put them into the questions box that is located in your control panel. We will be taking questions at the very end, so stick around if you have those questions and you want to hear what people are asking, and I'm very excited to have our panelists who support us in answering those questions. And then if you have to pop off for some reason, or you maybe you needed to come back and review the materials, they will be posted on our website at jbayforyouth.org, and there will also be a follow-up email that you will receive as well. So again, thank you for coming with us today as we go through this webinar. Your presenters are myself, Tia, here at John Burton Advocates for Youth, Debbie Rauscher, also John Burton Advocates for Youth. We have Mark Kantrowitz from savingforcollege.com and David LeVay from Hondo College. All right, let's go ahead and get into the material. So as we may or may not know, the FAFSA is really what starts and the #1 place to start to receive financial aid and support for college. This is where you start to get your state grants, your federal governments are funding it, state and universities are looking at the FAFSA, fee waivers, grants, again, work study and loans. We will be focusing on grants and work study and fee waivers for the understanding the FAFSA. Excuse me. And so just so that you know, the first step into getting financial aid for college is going to be completing that FAFSA, and that's what we're going to go over today. A very quick overview and defining what cost of attendance is and defining need. So cost of attendance is literally the cost of attending college, which includes tuition, housing, it can include transportation costs, etc. They're going to subtract that expected family contribution, which is a number that we will explain later, and then that is how they actually base need-based aid. And this is how they are calculating how much you will get in fee waivers and grants and subsidized loans. Okay, so you have your cost of attendance minus the expected family contribution, and that's how we're going to get that number of need-based aid that qualifies us for, again, fee waivers, grants, and loans. So how do you apply for financial aid? Okay, so there's 3 parts in maximizing the types of financial aid that you're going to get. Completing the FAFSA, which is what we're going to go over. If you are a foster youth or you're working with someone who happens to also be a foster youth, they're going to complete the Chafee grant, which is about 10 minutes to complete. And then they're going to create a Web Grants for Students account. This is for all students that we highly advise attending school in California. This is going to take about 10 minutes. And we'll talk about both the Chafee grant and the Web Grants, creating a Web Grants for Student account later in the presentation as well. So what do you need to bring, or what are you telling your students or your youth that you're working with to bring as they're completing the financial aid application? So they want to have that Social Security number. They want to make sure that the information that they're entering on their FAFSA matches exactly as it is on their Social Security number and the Social Security card. Okay, if they are completing the California DREAM Act, if they are completing the California DREAM Act, they want to get the statewide, complete that statewide ID number that's recommended for students, again, that are completing the California DREAM Act. The email address, and this needs to be an email address that the youth is completing frequently, checking frequently. So this is to avoid any, maybe they're temporary email addresses, maybe it's a high school email address. I know that sometimes there's, maybe they're doing a program and they provide them with an email address. They want an email address that they have access to and that they check frequently. Okay, this is where they are going to be checking for those updates and the FAFSA applications. They want a list of at least up to 10 schools. They can update later on the schools that they input, but they want to have an initial 10 list of schools. Okay, and any tax income for prior year, and we will talk about this a little bit more in the presentation. Students may be able to use the what's called as the IRS data retrieval tool to transfer the information that they had on their taxes if they happen to file taxes, and transfer that information directly into the FAFSA. Okay, and so where do you apply to financial aid? So there are two applications that you may be aware of. Of course, there's a FAFSA. So this is for students that are in youth that are U.S. citizens, a permanent resident, or other non-eligible citizens. Right? And then you have the CADA, or the California Dream Act. Okay, this is for if a student is undocumented. This website is, as you can see on the screen, both of the websites are there listed for you. It does mimic the FAFSA, and so if youth are, again, undocumented, they can complete that California Dream Act. I do want to make a note with the California Dream Act that the California Dream Act is not linking to the federal government. It is confidential information. They're not sharing it with other federal agencies. This does include immigration enforcement. So if you are working with a youth that is undocumented, or you yourself are undocumented, and you're a little nervous about completing that application, just know that this information isn't being shared with federal entities. Okay. So the FAFSA application is also available on your smartphone. It is available on an Android and also in the Apple Store. So if you are working with a youth and maybe you guys have started the application together and wanted to maybe pick it up later, or maybe they don't have access to a laptop, this can be completed online. This can be completed on a phone app. Okay, so now we are ready to begin the FAFSA. And I do want to again emphasize that in the presentation, the one that is in the handout section on GoToWebinar is going to be a very detailed version. This is going to be a less detailed version so that we can focus on the content and the and not so much on the words on the screen, so to speak. So if you notice that there are some differences, you are correct, there are some differences. Okay, and so I do want to make sure that we remember that the FAFSA is a free application. So if you are supporting a youth, or you yourself are completing the FAFSA, and you're on a website that's asking for money to help you complete the FAFSA, there is the free website is free application for federal student aid, or studentaid.ed.gov. Okay, so So if you are a returning student or a returning person completing the FAFSA, you're going to log in using the returning user. This is going to likely transfer your data in from the very previous year that you completed it. But this webinar is going to be focusing on youth and students that have just completed, that have never completed the FAFSA before. So if you've never completed the FAFSA before, you're going to hit the start here under the new to FAFSA process. Okay. So if you've never completed the FAFSA, you're likely going to have to do a FSA ID. Okay? And this is what you'll use to actually sign the FAFSA in order to complete it. Okay? So this next process is going to be how to actually create your FSA ID. So when you click on I am a student, you will be taken to this screen. Okay? Then you will click create one, aka create a FSA ID. Okay? Then you're going to be taken to a new screen. This screen is where you're actually going to be creating your FSA ID. And you're going to identify and select a username. You're going to create a password. Make sure you confirm the password. I do want to emphasize and make sure that if you're working with someone that is completing the FAFSA, making sure that they have something to document all of these new passwords and usernames, and even that new email address that they're creating, because they are going to need this in the future. Okay, then you click continue. Next, you're going to have the personal information that they're going to need to complete. They need to do their first name, middle initial, last name, and social security number. This is where, if you remember that I had mentioned earlier, to enter the information that is exactly on that social security number or social security card. This again is important, as if they don't, it could hold up just financial aid disbursements. It could actually mess up Cal Grant eligibilities and matching processes. And so making sure that the name is exactly as it appears on the social security number is really, really important and crucial in this process. Okay. Then the student needs to create an email. Again, this needs to be an email that the student checks frequently. Again, you don't want to use an email address that is going to expire, such as maybe a high school email address. Creating one through Gmail or Google or Microsoft is definitely the way to go. Right? They're going to want to make sure they can enter a mobile number. This mobile number is what they can use to it's again for more security purposes. They could use it to log into their FAFSA as well. A mailing address, if the youth is experiencing homelessness, they can use a friend or family's address that can check and receive the email for them. Some colleges also can provide a PO box or an email that can the address that the student can use. And then once all of this information is entered, then you're going to click continue. On this screen, the youth will be identifying and creating challenge questions. Okay, so these questions should be something that the youth can easily remember, and it's used if and when they forget their username and password. Okay, so then you just want to make sure and verify that all of the information is correct. You click continue. Make sure that they are checking that box, I certify. If they don't check that box, then they actually can't continue. So then once they check that box, they'll hit continue. Okay, and so again, I can't emphasize enough to make sure that the youth and the students are writing this down, okay, writing down that username and password, email address. If there's an error, they need to go back, and other reasons that they may need to go back into that FAFSA to complete and make corrections to errors. Okay, so now that they have completed and made their FSA ID, now they're actually ready to start completing that FAFSA. Okay, so we're going to be taken back to that first screen, and then when they log in, they click I am a student. Now they will be able to input their FSA ID, their username and password, okay, and then they will continue. Once they enter, they will be met with this disclaimer screen. They will just hit making sure that they understand that they're accessing a federal database and that they are entering information into a federal database. They will click accept. Okay, so now they're going to be met with a screen of either starting a FAFSA for this upcoming academic year, so 2020, 2021. This is important, as if you are supporting a student that is going to be starting in the fall of 2020, you want to make sure that they're completing that 2020, 2021 FAFSA. Okay, if you have a student, many times it can be confusing, as students that are in the current academic year think that they have to complete the other FAFSA. No, they need to actually complete the FAFSA for the upcoming academic year. So for this year, upcoming academic year is going to be 2020, 2021. Okay, so then at this point, they're going to be creating a save key. This is if they are going to be saving it later, if they need to save it and come back. Maybe they only had 10 minutes to complete it. If they create a save key, they will be able to go back into that save key and pick up right where they left off. Okay, so again, just another reminder that making sure that we remind youth to save all the information, FSA ID, FSA password, etc. And then now we're adding on to that save key. So, as we are seeing, there's a lot of information for youth to make sure that they have access to very quickly so that they can complete the FAFSA without many barriers. Okay, so this is just an information screen on kind of what they're going to go through and the steps to complete it. Okay, they'll just hit next. Okay, so now on this screen, this is where they're going to start entering that personal information. So up here, you'll see where all the sections that they need to complete in order to complete the FAFSA. We will talk about the demographic and from the parent information in coming up here. So let's go ahead and get started. Here you can also see that as you go through the screens, it will automatically save. So if it has not saved or you haven't clicked that save button, make sure that before you go to a next screen that it is saved. Okay. So once you enter, the information here is actually going to automatically populate based on the FSA ID. So this is just really important to make sure that if the social security number is not matching, if the name is not matching and the date of birth is wrong, you need to go back into the FSA ID and fix that. Okay. So this is just making sure and reviewing that this information is in fact correct. Okay, so we have student demographic information. Okay, so again, social security number, their first name, their last name. We want to make sure that's correct and click next. Okay, so here's where they're going to be entering their email address again, and they're going to re-enter that email address. Okay, this is making sure again that they have an email address that they check frequently, making sure they put in their phone number. Okay, this information is not going to be automatically populated. They will have to enter this information automatically into this information themselves. Once they enter that information, they're going to click next. Okay, so here's where they're going to be entering additional student information, including their address. Again, if you are working with a youth or you yourself do not have a permanent address, you can use a friend, a family member, or again, you can contact the college and see if they have an address that they are able to let the youth use. Okay, so here is where you will this is asking about state of legal residence. If you have selected that you lived in California for at least 5 years, you may qualify for a Cal Grant in addition to federal student aid. Okay, a separate application isn't required for the Cal Grant. This is an automatic process that happens. There is information that the high school is responsible for submitting, such as a verified GPA and high school completion. Okay. Okay, so again, you will select if you have lived in California for at least 5 years and if you are a US citizen. Okay, once you have entered that, then you'll hit next. Okay. So what will your high school completion status be as of beginning of year 2020? So this is if you are graduating, then it will be graduated with a high school diploma. If you're uncertain, if you will be, I'm sorry, if you are, excuse me. Okay. Okay, so this is if this question is related to the college that you and the degree that you're working towards when you can begin this academic year and this college in 2020. This is important as if you are currently a concurrent enrollment student, you're still technically a high school student and you would still, and you're entering into your first freshman year, you would still be working on your first degree or your first college degree. Okay. Again, same thing here. If you're working on your first bachelor's, again, if you are a concurrent enrollment student, you would actually be saying yes to this question. If you put no to this question, this could actually also mean delays in your financial aid disbursements. Okay, and then what will your college grade level be when you begin in 2020, 2021? Again, this is going to be freshman if this is your first time attending college. Again, if you are a concurrent enrollment student, then you will select that you are in your first year. Okay, and then this question is related to work study. This is working to earn a paycheck while you're on campus. I highly advise that students have clicked yes on this question. They can turn it down later if they're offered it, but they don't want to work. But they would want to click yes on this to make sure that the financial aid department can identify that they are interested in doing work study and reach out to them as appropriate. Okay, so once they've entered that information, then they're going to hit next. Okay, so this question is asking this additional student information. Are you male or female? I do want to emphasize that this is the sex that is assigned at birth on the certificate. So if you're working with a trans student and they are not sure what to put on this question, it is going to be related to the sex on their birth certificate. Okay. So if the student is between 18 and 25, they are required to register for the selective service. If the student has selected no on this question, then it will prompt to ask if they want to register for the selective service. I do want to emphasize on this one, if they are completing the California DREAM Act, they are still required to register for the selective service. They would not be able to do it on the website in most cases. They will have to do a paper application and send that in. Okay, once they answer those questions, they will hit next. So a student driver's license, the student is not required to enter a driver's license. If they have one, this is just for additional security reasons and purposes. If they have a driving record, parking tickets, it won't affect their eligibility for financial aid. They will put in their driver's license number and then the state that they are, and then they will hit next. Okay, so then the youth will be asked if they at any time were in the foster care system. If they answer yes to this question, this doesn't necessarily mean that they will have, but this is not the dependency status section yet. It could be extra things that the college can reach out to. Many colleges use this question for additional supports and programs that they offer on this campus. If they don't know the answer to the highest level of completed by a parent, they can put other or unknown. Okay. And then once they answer those questions, and then they'll hit next. Okay, so if a student has, we'll ask if they have ever received federal student aid. If they hit yes, it's going to go through a series of eligibility questions that are related to convictions. So if they hit, have you ever been convicted of a possession or illegal sale? If they hit yes on any of these, then it'll start prompting additional questions. So they hit yes, then it'll ask additional questions. If it is a drug-related offense, it'll then ask if the offense occurred while they were receiving financial aid. And then at that point, it'll then ask if they have completed an acceptable drug rehabilitation program. And then based on those questions, it'll say whether they are or not eligible to receive FAFSAs or receive federal financial aid. Okay, so school selection. Okay, so this is where they're going to enter their high school. Okay, so it is important that they are inputting the high school and they are selecting the high school as it has it on the federal government side. So we're actually going to go through a couple slides to make sure that I show everyone how to do that. So let's say that a student is attending Balboa High School that is in San Francisco. They want to hit search, okay, not next yet. Okay, so if they hit search, then they will be taken to a screen that shows all of the high schools that match that description. Okay, so as we see here, that first one is actually Balboa High, not Balboa High School. Okay, so then once they hit that, then they're going to hit select. This is important as for Cal Grant eligibility, especially because it could mean that there is an unmatched, the high school can be unmatched to the student because the state is matching to how exactly the high school is named, is listed to the federal government and the Department of Education. Okay, so inputting and making sure they use that search function on the on that FAFSA is really crucial and important. Okay. So as we can see, it'll automatically input it into here as Balboa High, right? And then Once they have done that, then they will hit next. Okay, so this is where they will input the college name and the colleges that they're in. Again, they can put up to 10. It is not required to put up to 10, but they can put up to 10 colleges. Okay, so again, and it's not required to put 10 colleges. Okay, if they only wanted to put one college, they can. They just want to make sure that they're putting the colleges that they are interested in going to, even if they haven't been accepted, into here, so that their information, their financial aid information, their FAFSA goes to that college. Okay, so they'll put in all the identifying information that they know. If they do know the federal school code, which they can access here on the website, that's great. Then they can input that. Otherwise, they can select it by state, the city, and then, of course, the school name. Okay, then they'll hit search. I want to make sure that they are entering and selecting the right high school. Sometimes there's, colleges. Colleges can have very similar names, so just making sure that the youth is selecting the right college that they are sending their information to. Okay, so once they have selected the colleges that they were interested in, then they will select that college, and then they will hit next. Okay, so you can send your FAFSA again to additional schools even after the FAFSA has been processed. Okay, so that's really important to note. Okay, so then once you have entered all of the the colleges that you were interested in, okay, here we have a 4-year college and a 2-year college, then they will hit next. Okay, and then at that point, you'll be taken to the dependency section. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it over to Debbie Rauscher, who will be discussing dependency.
All right, thanks so much, Tia. Before I jump in, just a couple of quick reminders. So if you have questions, please feel free to go ahead and send them through the chat box on your control panel. We're so excited and just absolutely thrilled that we have Mark and David on with us today. Truly experts in financial aid. So Tia, just FYI, we're seeing, I think, the chat on the screen there, so we'll just let you know that. So we're really excited to have Mark and David on. Any questions you might have about the FAFSA, please do send them our way, and we do have time at the end of the webinar to make sure that we get a chance to answer all of your questions. And so the other thing I just want to remind folks, Tia did say this at the beginning, but we're sharing a ton of information right now, and all of what we are saying aloud is actually printed on the handout. And so hopefully you're not trying to furiously take notes as we're going through this. What we're showing you on the screen right now are just the screenshots from the FAFSA itself, but we actually have all of this information kind of printed as notes on the handout version of the presentation so that you can have easy access to all of this. All right, so we're going to jump in now to the dependency status section. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is the section that is determining whether or not a student is considered dependent or independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. And what that means essentially is whether their expected family contribution is going to be determined based on their income alone, just the student themselves, or if it's going to be based on the income as well of their parents. And so if they get determined to be independent, what that means is they don't have to provide any income information about their parents. They only need to provide that information about themselves, and that income information is what their financial aid will be based on. If they are determined to be dependent, then that means that their financial aid does take into consideration their parents' income as well. So there's a series of questions that walks them through all the various elements that go into determining dependent and independent status. So the first of these questions is whether they're married, because if they are married, then they're automatically considered independent. One thing that's important to remind youth of is that they are considered single if they are not married, even if they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. In more colloquial terms, if you have a boyfriend, you don't necessarily describe yourselves as single, but for the purposes of the FAFSA, if you're not legally married, whether you live with your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, you are considered single. So then we go ahead and click next, and then go to the next slide. Then it asks you about whether you have children or other dependents. So again, this is, something that could potentially make a student be considered independent if they do have or will have children who receive more than half of their support from the student. They would click yes to that. If they have dependents of children or spouse who live with them and receive more than half of their support, that's going to be less likely. Then they would click yes. If they answer yes to either one of these questions, again, this qualifies them as an independent student. So then we go ahead and click next and move on to the next slide. If they're not married, they don't have dependent children, they're then asked a series of questions about other things that could make a student independent. So first they're asked at any time since they were 13, were their parents deceased or were they in foster care? So if they answer yes to that question, then they would be considered independent. They are also asked if they have a legal guardian, they're in a legal guardianship, then that would make them an independent student. If none of those apply, and you can see there's some other ones about being a veteran and such, but if none of those apply, then they would click none of the above, and then next. And then this takes them to the final dependency question, which is the one that we are most interested in on this webinar, which is, on or after July 1st, 2019, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So students who are homeless or self-supporting and at risk do qualify as independent for the purposes of the FAFSA, meaning they don't have to provide parental information. Now I'm going to jump into a lot more detail about what this means. So let's say they click yes, that they believe that they qualify. Well, what does that mean exactly? How is a student determined to be a homeless student for the purposes of the FAFSA? There's two elements to qualifying for independent status. The first is that they have to be unaccompanied. In other words, not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So if a student is homeless with their parents or parent, so for example, they're living in a family shelter with their parents or parent, or maybe they're sleeping in a car with one of their parents, those students would not qualify as independent. Now, of course, they are still homeless, but they would need to report the income of their parents, who in this situation are homeless along with them, as part of the determination of their eligibility for financial aid. So that's the first part, is unaccompanied. The second part is that they're either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So what does homeless mean? Homelessness uses the McKinney-Vento definition that's used within other educational contexts, which means that they are lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate housing. So this is really at the core of the definition of what it means to be homeless for the purposes of the FAFSA. They lack a fixed, regular, and adequate housing situation. And I'm going to talk in a second with the next slide a little bit more about what that means. So, but before we go there, if we can go back to the previous slide, actually. So in addition to being homeless, a student can be what's called self-supporting and at risk of being homeless in order to qualify. So what does that mean? Self-supporting means a student pays for his or her own living expenses, including their housing. So if a parent is supporting a student, or another relative is providing money for housing or other expenses, they're not considered self-supporting. But if they're paying all their own way, then they're self-supporting. And they're at risk of being homeless, which means the student's housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. For example, if a student has received an eviction notice, has to be out of their place in the next week, and they haven't found fixed, regular, and adequate housing yet to move into, they are considered at risk of being homeless. So if they're self-supporting and at risk, but not homeless yet, and they're unaccompanied, they would qualify for independent status. So it does get a little bit complicated. One thing to just note is that a student living in any of these situations who is fleeing an abusive parent is still considered homeless, even if the parent would provide support and a place to live. And this came about, I think, there might have been circumstances where a student is homeless and perhaps they are viewed by the financial aid office as somebody who ran away from home. That's how it appears to the financial aid office. And the parent is saying, hey, if this kid comes back, I'm happy to give him a place to live. And so the financial aid office might say, well, they're not really homeless, or they're kind of homeless by choice because they can just go home and they'll have a place to live. But if the student left the home situation because it was an abusive situation, even though that parent is saying, sure, they can come back and live with me, that student can still be considered homeless. They can still qualify as independent because of the fact that that home situation was abusive. So now if we moved on to the next slide, a little bit more about what the McKinney-Vento definition means. So it does include people sleeping outside in their cars, parks, abandoned buildings, if somebody's living in substandard housing, but it also includes children and youth who are sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason, essentially couch surfers. So if somebody has a couch to sleep on or floor to sleep on, but they're bouncing around from place to place because they don't have fixed and stable housing, they do qualify as homeless for the purposes of the FAFSA. So there are some other definitions of homelessness for housing programs and such where couch surfers don't qualify as homeless, but they do qualify as homeless for the purposes of the FAFSA. Next slide. Okay, so the student has checked yes, I meet this definition, I qualify as homeless. Next, they are asked if they have verification, essentially, did they receive a determination from one of three entities? The high school or school district homeless liaison, the HUD-funded emergency shelter or transitional housing program, or a runaway or homeless youth basic center or transitional living program. So the high school liaisons, folks might be familiar with. These are also referred to as McKinney-Vento liaisons. HUD-funded shelter, so this is any kind of shelter or transitional housing program that receives all or part of its funding from the federal government, from HUD. And then runaway and homeless youth basic centers and transitional living programs. This is a very specific type of program that is funded through the federal government. So it's not just any homeless youth center, but it's one that's designated because of the types of funding it receives through the runaway and homeless youth program. So the first question is, do they have verification from one of these three entities? So if we go to the next slide. So a little bit more about what this means. So these three folks have the authority to give the final word on whether a student qualifies as homeless. Now, if they don't have access to one of these three types of entities, there is an alternative path, which we're going to talk about, which is to have the financial aid administrator at the campus make the determination. But the easier route is if they have one of these three entities. So if they're currently in high school and that high school liaison can give a verification and say, yes, this person meets the definition of homelessness, then they would check that box on the previous question showing a homeless youth liaison can make this determination. One thing to just note, a sort of somewhat newer rule, is that these three entities can continue to make the determination in subsequent years as long as they have access to the information necessary to make that determination. So if a high school liaison makes a determination for a student when they're a high school senior, and then the following year they need to get a determination again, and they're still in contact with that homeless liaison at the high school, even though they're not in high school anymore, and that liaison is aware of their current housing situation, they are allowed to continue to make that determination. So then if we go on to the next slide, this is a link, and again, this whole thing is downloadable from your control panel, and we will send it out after the presentation. But this is a link where you can get a sample form letter that these three entities can use. And one thing I'll just say about this letter is that if you were to download it and take a look at it, you will see that it's a very simple letter that literally basically just says, yes, this person meets the definition of homelessness, or no, they do not. And so it does not ask for any information describing the circumstances of somebody's homelessness or where they're sleeping or any of that. if it is one of these 3 authorized entities, the McKinney-Vento liaison, a HUD shelter, or a runaway and homeless youth shelter or transitional living program, all they have to say is, yes, I have determined this, and that is good enough. There's no additional information that the financial aid office needs in order to certify that that student qualifies as homeless. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, what about a student who doesn't have access to one of these 3 entities? So they're going to have to check none of the above. They can still qualify as homeless, but the process for verifying that is going to be a little bit different. So if we go on, we then click next and go on. They're going to get a pop-up that tells them that they are saying that they're homeless, but they check none of the above in terms of who can verify them. What this means is that they're going to be told, you're going to have to go talk to the financial aid office at your school and have your financial aid administrator make the determination. Now, in the meantime, they're not going to have their financial aid eligibility determined, because they're saying, okay, you're saying that you're homeless, we're going to need a little bit more information in order to figure that out. So if we go to the next slide, this is where it says that. So they're going to be told very explicitly that they can move forward sort of based on an assumption that they're going to qualify as an independent student, meaning that they're not going to be asked information about their parents. However, until that's verified by their financial aid office, the expected family contribution, which the college would be using to determine eligibility for financial aid, will not yet be calculated. So this is really important for these students to understand, is that there is this extra step. They will have to go in and get their homeless status confirmed by the financial aid administrator before anything else can move forward in their financial aid process. So this is really crucial information. If we go to the next slide. Few other things to just be aware of about homeless youth who are completing the FAFSA. So first is I want to talk a little bit about how this financial aid administrator makes the determination that a student is homeless. There's a couple of different ways that they can do this. So first is they can reach out to others in order to help make the determination. So if the student is participating in some sort of college access program like TRIO or a nonprofit organization, if they're at another kind of shelter that maybe wasn't funded by HUD or the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, if they have a mental health provider or a healthcare professional they're working with, they can reach out to any one of these people and talk with them and verify that the student is homeless. However, we know that for a lot of homeless students, they're not necessarily connected in with service systems. Maybe they're just sleeping in their car and trying to make do, and they've actually been doing their best to try to hide the fact that they're homeless rather than advertising that. And so there aren't a lot of people, or maybe there's nobody in their life who's even aware of the fact that they're experiencing homelessness. There is no kind of written documentation that some provider can make available. In these circumstances, the financial aid administrator is authorized to make the determination based on a documented interview with the student. So they can sit down and ask the student, so where are you staying right now? Oh, you're sleeping in your car. Maybe they want to ask a couple questions to verify that. Where do you usually park the car? That kind of thing. And once they determine, like, yes, okay, sleeping in a car does qualify as homeless, they can just make a note and document this and say this person is homeless. And so this does get tricky sometimes for financial aid officers, and they really are not supposed to be asking a whole bunch of questions about, well, why are you homeless? And you're really delving into the details. All they're really supposed to be determining is, does the person meet that definition? Are they in a situation where their living situation is not fixed, stable, and adequate, without needing to delve into all of the particulars of why and how, etc. So hopefully the financial aid officers are aware of the boundaries of their responsibility. Sometimes students may need advocacy and support in this stage of the process. Another thing to know is that if a student receives a determination from one of those three special entities, the liaison, the RHYA or HUD-funded shelter or transitional housing program, the financial aid administrator must accept this determination. So if the McKinney-Vento liaison is saying, I think this person is homeless, and the financial aid administrator is saying, well, yeah, you think they're couch surfing, but it seems to me that, you know, they've been sleeping on this couch for a couple of months now. That seems stable to me. It's not up to them. If that McKinney-Vento person is saying that they qualify as homeless, the financial aid administrator must accept that determination, unless they have information to the contrary. If they determine that the student is actually was lying to the McKinney-Vento liaison or something, but short of a situation like that, they do have to accept that determination. Another thing to know is that a student who is living in a dorm may still be considered an unaccompanied homeless youth if that student would be homeless otherwise. And so if they don't have someplace to go during the upcoming summer break or something like that, but they're currently in the dorm, they still do qualify as homeless. Last thing to say about this is that a new determination must be made each year in order to continue to qualify as independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. So for this reason, if the student does qualify through one of the other means, like let's say they were also in foster care after the age of 13, or they were in guardianship, or they have dependent children, those are actually sort of easier ways to qualify as independent status, in that those are circumstances that typically are not going to change, whereas whether or not the student is homeless may change over time. And in subsequent years, if they no longer meet that definition of homelessness, they're no longer independent and would need to provide information about their parents' income. Now, a couple of things to just note about that as well. Number one, once a student turns 24, they're automatically independent. None of these other factors matter. Another thing to know is that the financial aid office does have discretion to exercise what they refer to as professional judgment, where they can look case by case at individual student situations and make determinations that a student should be independent. So if you have a student who you feel like maybe doesn't quite fit precisely into one of these circumstances, but for other reasons you think should be considered independent, know that you can reach out to the financial aid office at the school, and the student can have that conversation with the financial aid office to see if there might be an opportunity for exercising professional judgment. All right, so that is the dependency status section. Now we're going to get into financials. So there are, I'm just going to talk about students who with independent status. We're not going to go into the whole piece about parental income, but just know that the parental income section looks the same as what I'm going to walk through for independent students. So this I'm going to walk through speaking to it as if it is the student's income themselves that we're reporting, but if they also do need to report parental income, then they would go through this whole same process for their parents, but we're not going to delve into that piece. So there are three types of financial options. One is the student has already completed a tax return. The second is that they plan to file a tax return. And the third is that they are not going to file a tax return. So if we go to the next slide, one of the most important things is that they're understanding what year we are talking about in terms of whether they did file or going to file or won't be filing a tax return. So the year that we are referring to is, it's called the prior year. That's sort of how most people talk about it. What that means is that if I am filing my FAFSA for this current application cycle, which started on October 1st and will continue to run for quite a while, basically through the end of the academic year. So I'm filing my application basically in sort of the 1920 application period, and I'm filing it for the 2021 enrollment period. That's going to be the academic year. I'm going to use my income information and my tax information from 2018. So if I'm filing my FAFSA today, we're in 2019 right now, I am providing the information for the previous year, essentially 2018. The reason it's called prior though is because most people are filling out their FAFSA after January 1st. So let's say I'm filling out my FAFSA in February of 2020, then I'm still using my 2018 tax information, so prior year. And even, let's say I don't file my FAFSA for quite a while, and I'm filing my FAFSA in May of 2020, and I've already, I did file my tax return for 2019 back on April 15th. I'm still using the 2018 tax information. So even if I have already filed my 2019 tax information at the point I'm submitting my FAFSA, doesn't matter, I'm still using 2018 in terms of all of these questions that relate to income. Okay, so we select one of these three choices: already completed, will file, not going to file. Now, what if I said already completed IRS income tax return? So here I am, I'm filing my FAFSA today. I had enough income back in 2018 where I did file my tax return. If we go to the next slide, the easiest thing for a student to do in this circumstance is to use the IRS data retrieval tool. This is a tool that allows a student to pull their information straight from the IRS into their FAFSA. You don't have to worry about making errors or anything. If they have this option, it's strongly recommended that they use it. If we go to the next slide, the way that this works is if I go ahead and say, yes, I want to use the data retrieval tool, I'm going to get this notice that I'm leaving the FAFSA temporarily to go to the data retrieval tool. So I'm going to say, yes, go ahead and proceed to the IRS site. Then I get this pop-up that this is for authorized use only. I'm going to click OK. Now, this information that pops up and is shown here is auto-populated. This is not something a student is filling out. This is pulling from the information that they provided on their FAFSA. And so if everything looks okay, then they go ahead and click Submit. And then, so if they click Submit, then they get basically this screen that says, yeah, I want to go ahead and transfer my tax information. So they can either do transfer now, or if they change their mind and they say, oops, I don't want to do this, then they have the option to say don't transfer. But we're going to assume that everything looks hunky-dory, and they go ahead and hit transfer now. And then they go back to the FAFSA, and it will say you have successfully transferred your 2018 tax information. Now, one thing to note is that because of privacy restrictions, it will not show on the FAFSA any of the data that got transferred. So you won't see the income amount, you won't see the tax amount, any of that information that got populated into the FAFSA is kept hidden. So you just have to know that it's there and trust that it was correctly transferred from the IRS. And you go ahead and click Next. And so if you click No Thanks, if you said no, I don't want to use the data retrieval tool, it will give you a reminder and will say, actually, it's a lot easier to use the data retrieval tool. Are you sure you don't want to use it? And if you're sure you don't want to use it, then you click No Thanks, and it will then take you to the next slide, which is the option to enter your income information manually. And so if for some reason the student can't or isn't comfortable with using the data retrieval tool, they can enter the information manually. They do need to have their tax forms handy. It does tell you what line on the form. And so if you filed a 1040, it'll say, what's your adjusted gross income from IRS form 1040 line 7. And so that is handy so that the student knows exactly what line they're pulling from, because as anybody who's filed taxes know, there's all kinds of, there's a gross income and adjusted gross income and after tax and before tax and all these different things. So you want to make sure they're getting the right line there. It'll then ask for how much did you earn from working? Again, it'll tell you exactly what line to include. Now note that if a student participated in work study the previous year, then this will include the amount that was earned at their work study job, and we're going to talk a couple of minutes about that, about the sort of the nuance of work study. But if we then go to the next slide, it'll then say amount of your income tax, We go to the next slide. This slide asks some additional questions about income. You may or may not be asked to answer these questions. If a student's income is below a certain threshold, then there actually will be a question that asks if they would like to skip the remaining questions about income and assets. And so I think for a lot of our students, we're going to find that they will have this option to just skip some of these other income and asset questions. There is no penalty for saying that you want to skip those questions. So if a student is asked, do you want to skip the rest of the questions, they should definitely say yes. If we go on to the next slide, you will see that there is a totally separate question that asks about taxable earnings from need-based employment programs such as work study. And you want to make sure that the student is entering their work study amount here. And this is a little confusing, but basically work study income is subtracted from the total income. So if it's included in what they put on their tax return, and so it's going to be pulled in with that IRS data retrieval process. And we want to make sure that they're also putting it here so that it gets subtracted from the total amount of income that's considered when their financial aid package is being put together. So they need to have that work study amount kind of separated out to include here. Next slide. It then asks about various other forms of income. Now, one of the boxes is just sort of a very general other untaxed income not reported, such as workers' compensation, disability benefits, etc. This can be a place that's a little confusing. A few things to note that do not get reported in this section. So if a student that you're working with is in the foster care system and they are receiving payments through the foster care system, they can receive them through something called a supervised independent living placement, where they actually receive money themselves directly to cover their cost of living. That is not considered income for the purposes of the FAFSA, does not need to be reported on the FAFSA. If a student is receiving CalWORKs payments, that is not reportable on the FAFSA. If they are receiving untaxed Social Security benefits, that is not considered other income for the purposes of the FAFSA. If they receive SSI, long-term disability payments, that is also not considered income for the purposes of the FAFSA. So we want to make sure they're not doing themselves a disservice by reporting some sort of income that's actually not required. If we go to the next slide. So again, chances are if their income is fairly low, they're going to get an option to skip information about reporting their assets. But if their income is not below that threshold, then they are going to be asked some questions about what is the balance of their bank accounts and any other investments that they might have. All right, so that's for students who did file tax return. Now, if you select will file, if we go to the next slide, actually, so they select will file, and then they're going to get a notice that says, you indicated you will file taxes, you've missed the deadline. So just to make sure that people aren't confused, again, with this whole prior year thing, if they're, even if they are submitting their FAFSA on the very first day of FAFSA season, October 1st, their tax return was due back on April 15th, unless they requested an extension. So if they're saying they will file, they're late. And so this is an unusual circumstance that I don't think we'll find that often. But if we go to the next slide, there is a process. Let's see. So remember, if a student selects will file, they will have to update their FAFSA once they have filed their federal income tax return. So if they plan to do it, make sure that they're aware of that. If we go to the next slide. So then there's a process that kind of walks them through how to estimate their income. They can use the previous year. They can also use something called an income estimator. We go to the next slide. And from there, the rest of the questions are the same as what we just walked through. If they say that they're not going to file, let's go to the next slide. They're going to select not going to file. And then if we can click there. So if a student isn't sure if they made enough money to file taxes. It does vary year by year, but as an example, in 2018, a student who was single, under 65, with a gross income of at least $12,000 was supposed to file a tax return. And this is gross income of at least $12,000, so before any deductions or taxes were taken out. All right. One other thing to note, well, actually, okay, so here we are. How much did you earn from working? So if you didn't file a tax return, if they have W-2s or some 1099s, if they were doing contract work, they're going to add those up and indicate how much they earned from working. Now, before I go on to the sign and submit section, I just want to say one thing about students who don't file a tax return. So there's a relatively new rule that some students who are flagged for verification who did not file a tax return are required to submit a verification of non-filing letter from the IRS. And it's a letter that says that it's true that they did not file a tax return. This is a pretty onerous requirement, unfortunately. And so if a student did not file a tax return and they're submitting their FAFSA, they might want to start working on getting this verification. And there is a handout that's downloadable from the control panel. There's a form that has to be filled out and sent into the IRS. The Financial Aid Office can provide support if the student does get flagged for verification, but just know that that can be an extra hurdle a student has to go through if they hadn't filed a tax return. All right, so we're on to the final home stretch here with the FAFSA, the sign and submit section. If we go to the next slide. They'll be asked, are you a preparer? This is very rare. Even if there's an adult or mentor who's helping them complete the FAFSA, they are not considered a preparer. So go ahead and select no. And then there's going to be a section where you can view all the different options. And so where it says expand all there in the red box, if you click on that, it'll show you all of the information that you put into your FAFSA. You double check it, you got it all right. If you want a record for yourself, you can print a copy by clicking the print this page, which will come up in the red box. So we go ahead and do that, print this page, and then once it's printed and everything looks okay, they can click next. They're then going to have a statement that by signing this application, they're certifying various things that they agree are true. So they're going to click agree and they're going to click next. And then they are on to signing the FAFSA. Now, as you recall, Tia explained that when they created that FSA ID at the very beginning of this process, that allows them to sign the FAFSA without having to do a physical signature. So they're going to click sign this FAFSA and then next. And then they're going to get a screen that says you have provided all the necessary signatures. Click submit my FAFSA now. And that's what they're going to do. And then they're going to get a confirmation page that says, congratulations, your FAFSA has been submitted. It will provide a confirmation number and what's called a data release number. And so the student should either write those down or print out this page so they have that information handy. A copy will be sent via email as well. And Tia mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it again. It's so important that students are reminded to check their email. If they do not check their email, then they're going to miss very important notifications that could jeopardize their ability to get financial aid. They'll usually receive a notification in about 3 to 5 days that the FAFSA was processed. Now, if they do need to make changes, they have to wait until they receive something called a student aid report, which I'm going to talk about right now. So if we go to after the FAFSA, so the FAFSA is the first step in the financial aid process. It is not the only step. There's a number of things that need to happen after that FAFSA is submitted in order to make sure the student actually gets their financial aid. So we want to make sure students are doing all of those needed steps as well. So first up, Once the FAFSA is processed, then if a student logs back into the FAFSA website, it will show them that the FAFSA was processed. Now, they have options to make corrections by choosing Make a FAFSA Correction, or they can also view or print their student aid report once that is available. If they want to either make a correction or print their student aid report, they'll be taken to a page that asks them for their FAFSA username and password, etc., in order to get access to that. From there, they're able to view the student aid report. If we go to the next slide, otherwise known as the SAR. And the SAR summarizes the information that was submitted on the FAFSA. It can take a few days or even a couple of weeks to receive the SAR, so don't worry if it doesn't pop up immediately. It will say what the EFC is, or expected family contribution. So if you look at this slide, you have to kind of squint to read it, but in the red box there, it says application receipt date. Under that, it says process date. And then in the second column, you've got the bunch of X's and O's. And then EFC, in this case, it says 0. So this would be a student whose income was low enough that they're not expected to contribute any money towards their own college costs, that they will receive the maximum amount of financial aid that's available to them. Now, if a student did have income, that number wouldn't necessarily be 0. It may be some other amount. So that's going to show you what the student is expected to contribute to their financial aid. At the bottom of this, there's an option to print this page as well. If we go to the next page, you're going to see what the SAR, the student aid report, looks like. And it'll say, hopefully, your FAFSA appears to be complete. And so you can see that the FAFSA has been submitted and you're all good. Now on the SAR itself, you'll see in the sort of the upper right-hand corner, you see the OMB number, the data release number, and then it says expected family contribution. There's a number of zeros there, but it still just means 0. So this again would be a student with a 0 EFC. If we go to the next slide, a couple other things to know. If you are a foster youth, if the student happens to also be a foster youth who is in care after the age of 16, they'll want to also apply for the Chafee grant. This provides up to $5,000 for up to 5 years per year, up until the age of 26. It can be used both in California and to go to out-of-state schools. The student has to have been in the foster care system as a dependent or ward of the court at some point after the age of 16, between 16 and 18. In order to submit this application, they do have to do a separate application in addition to the FAFSA. It's not automatic, and that can be found at the link that's shown there, chafee.csac.ca.gov. If we go to the next slide, you'll see what that looks like if you were to go to the Chafee Grant website. So it's pretty simple, just some basic contact information, some information about where they plan to go to school, and so couple of tips about Chafee Grant for those who are working with foster youth as well. It's recommended that they use Internet Explorer 7 and higher for this to work properly. Once you submit a Chafee Grant application once, you don't have to do it again. So it's just a one-time thing, unlike the FAFSA. The FAFSA has to be done every year. And school of attendance on this refers to the school that the student plans to attend for college. Now, if we go to the next slide, next thing we want the student to do after they've done all of this is set up a Web Grants account. So Web Grants account, this is a local state thing that will allow the student to see what they qualify for in terms of state aid, including the Chafee Grant that we just talked about and the Cal Grant. So if we go to the next slide, you can't actually set up your Web Grants account until the FAFSA is processed. So once the student sees that their FAFSA has been processed, they can go to this website shown, which is mygrantinfo.csac.ca.gov. There's also a phone number and an email there if a student needs support with setting up their Web Grants account. The next slide shows the login screen for the portal that allows students to access Web Grants. They can update their school information. So if they think they're going to one college and then they change their mind, they can update their address. If they move, they can make other corrections. And they can also verify whether the GPA verification that's needed for Cal Grant eligibility has been received. So here's the, so the screen, if we can go back, this is where a student would edit their contact information. And then if we go to the next slide, once the student has set up their Web Grants account, again, they can look at their award status and amount for the Cal Grant and the Chafee Grant. They can see if there's any pending items that still need to be completed. They can confirm that their school of attendance is accurate. Again, this is the college they're planning to attend. They can verify that their GPA has been received. This is really important. So a student cannot receive a Cal Grant, the state aid, unless their FAFSA or DREAM Act application has been matched to a GPA from their high school. And the Cal Grant, I'm not going to get into the details on the Cal Grant, it's complicated. It can be worth various amounts depending on what kind of institution a student is going to. But at a CSU or UC, it can pay their entire tuition, which is many thousands of dollars. Even if they're at a community college, they can receive funding for non-tuition costs. And they can also, fairly new now, they can receive up to $6,000 a year if they are a parenting student for non-tuition costs. So Web Grants is where they're going to see and make sure that their high school GPA was matched to their FAFSA. If it wasn't, then they're going to want to contact their high school counselor or the Student Aid Commission to get that fixed. They can also enter their high school graduation date once that becomes available. And they can also see whether their foster youth status has been verified for the purposes of the Chafee Grant, if that's something they applied for. So go to the next slide. So 30%, at least 30% of all students are flagged to provide verification for the information provided on their application. So this again is why it's so important that they're checking their email, their regular mail, and their college student portal regularly. Because if they are asked to provide verification of their income or the fact that they didn't file taxes or their foster care status or anything else, if they don't provide that information, they may lose their chance to receive financial aid. So some helpful resources to be aware of, and just as a reminder, keep those questions coming in. We'll take the last 15 minutes to make sure we get to any questions you might have. So next slide, there's Cash for College. So CSAC offers FAFSA in-person workshops all across the state, and there's a link there that you can use to find a workshop near you. Many of these workshops do have computer lab space where students can come in and just do their FAFSA on the spot. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's also some information that Department of Education makes available to help students completing the FAFSA. They have a phone number and an email that can be used. Last but not least, I just want to, before we close out the webinar content, I want to remind people about priority registration and the Board of Governors fee waiver, now referred to as the California Promise Grant. So homeless students automatically receive priority registration and the Promise Grant. Priority registration in particular is a tremendous benefit that allows these students to register before the general student population, and so they can get access to the classes that they need. If we go to the next slide. In order to qualify as a homeless student for the purposes of priority registration, it's a little bit different than the FAFSA. The basic definition is for the most part the same. However, once a student is verified as homeless for the purposes of priority registration, they actually retain that status for a period of 6 years or until they reach age 25, whichever comes first. So they don't need to be re-verified every year as long as they are consistently enrolled in the same college where they were originally verified. If they change colleges, then they do need to be re-verified at the new college. Students don't need to be unaccompanied in order to qualify for priority registration. And so that's one difference from the FAFSA. And then a student can qualify as homeless not only if they're currently homeless, but if they were verified as homeless at any point during the 24 months prior to applying to college. So it is a broader definition for priority registration than it is for the FAFSA. All right, so we are now on to Q&A. So please go ahead and send any questions, either about what we covered right now, or you can answer any or ask any other FAFSA-related questions that you may have. So a couple things. So first, a comment that I'll just share about the FSA ID. You know, we did recommend that students write down their FSA ID. One person wanted us to note that it's also a good idea to warn students to protect their FSA ID, so don't leave it lying around, because it can be used to sign federal student loan docs. All right, so here is a question. So Mark, I'm going to direct this to you. So a student who is in her second year at college, who's filling out the FAFSA, she was determined to be homeless under McKinney-Vento at her high school last year. Will this be sufficient for the next year's FAFSA, or does she need to get verified again through the financial aid office at her school?
Unfortunately, it has to be renewed every year for the FAFSA, unlike the California program. For the FAFSA, you have to renew it every single year.
Okay, got it. And then David, I know you sent a couple of comments about the EFC through the chat. Do you want to share that information with folks?
Yes, the EFC is also indicated on the confirmation page. It's toward the middle of the page. And also on the confirmation page, the student will see a list of the colleges to which he or she asked to have the information sent. And they'll also know about their potential eligibility for the federal Pell Grant and the direct loan program.
Great.
A quick comment about the FSA ID. If you have a smartphone that can take pictures, what some people will do is they'll write down their FSA ID on a piece of paper and then take a picture of that to keep with them on their smartphone, and then throw away and destroy the piece of paper.
Great, thanks for that tip. So there's a couple questions that came in about the foster care status. So I'm going to go ahead and take those. So one is, do placements through juvenile court count as foster care ward of the court for the FAFSA? Does it depend on the kind of placement, being in juvenile hall versus a group home? So the answer is yes. A student who is placed through the juvenile court in out-of-home placement is considered a foster youth for the purposes of the FAFSA. In terms of does it depend on the kind of placement, it does. So a student who's, or not a student, but a youth who's incarcerated in juvenile hall is treated differently than a student who is placed into a group home. So a student who's put into a group home through the juvenile court would be considered a foster youth for the purposes of the FAFSA. A student who never had an order for any out-of-home placement but was instead incarcerated in juvenile hall would not necessarily be considered independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. And a youth who was in the juvenile justice system and never had an order for out-of-home placement, in other words, they were just placed on probation in the custody of their biological family, would not be considered a ward of the court for the purposes of FAFSA. Okay, the next question, I think this came in before I answered it, I think, in the webinar, but Mark, I'm going to ask you to address it anyway because I think it's an important point, which is, can a student self-certify that they were in an abusive situation?
Well, you can appeal for dependency override by contacting the college financial aid administrator at the school. The problem with self-certification is it's a weaker standard of evidence than the colleges normally require. They want to see independent third-party documentation of the circumstances. So, for example, something from a social worker, a teacher or guidance counselor, clergy, police reports, anything that is independent and hand's length. Anybody who's familiar with the student's situation. For example, if the student has been living on the couch of a friend, that friend can write a letter to say what they know about the student's situation. If there's no other source of information, the student can write a letter to self-certify, but it's going to have a more difficult time being accepted by the school without any confirming evidence.
And can they also, for a situation of abuse, I mean, that's one in particular where there might not be a third party who's aware of the situation. So can the student self-certify that? I understand that ideally there's third party, but sometimes that just doesn't exist.
Well, what some colleges will do is the college financial aid administrator will ask the student to meet with the counseling staff at the school and tell the counseling staff about their situation. And then that counseling staff will then render an opinion that they will provide to the college financial aid administrator to support the student self-certification. And the college financial aid administrators recognize that they aren't necessarily always equipped to evaluate a student's claims of abuse. So they will want a professional who has more experience to evaluate. Because unfortunately, there are some families, some students who won't be suffering from abuse, but will lie to get more financial aid. And that puts everyone else at a more
finding
difficult.
that balance. Yeah. Okay, the next question is, if a student selects yes, that they can get a verification from one of the three entities, the McKinney-Vento Liaison, HUD Shelter, or RHYA Shelter, what does the youth do with the actual letter? Do they need to provide that to the financial aid office in all circumstances, or only if it's requested?
Well, if they check the box on the FAFSA, they will only be asked for a copy, not the original of the letter, if they're selected for verification of that particular question on the FAFSA. But it's also a good idea, even if it's not asked for, to alert various offices on campus that you are a homeless student, so that they can tell you about resources on the campus that you might find helpful, like which dormitories will remain open during the various breaks throughout the year, whether there's a food pantry on campus, and other resources that they may find helpful.
Great. The next question I'm going to actually answer, which is, what if a student becomes homeless while in college? Do they get considered for priority registration? And the reason I'm answering this is because this is changing. So there was a bill passed this year, AB 806, which expanded the definition of who qualifies for priority registration. So in the past, a student who became homeless while in college did not qualify for priority registration. They had to have been homeless within 24 months prior to the time of application. And if they subsequently became homeless, they didn't qualify for priority registration. AB 806 changed that, and it goes into effect January 1st of 2020. So for the coming school year, now a student who becomes homeless after they enter college will qualify for priority registration, but this is new. And so it might take some advocacy with the colleges to make sure that everybody understands this. Mark, I'm going to put this next question to you, or David, either one of you. If a student owes money from a previous school enrollment and had to drop, is there a way for this to be forgiven so that they can qualify for financial aid?
They can always ask the college to which they owe the money to forgive the debt. And there is a limited number of programs out there that will provide money to pay off small amounts of debt just to enable students to finish their education. I don't remember the names off the top of my head, but unfortunately, the only leverage a college has to ensure that their debts are repaid is to withhold academic transcripts, the official version. I mean, an unofficial version they will provide you with a copy of, but it'll be stamped unofficial. And the other colleges generally will require an official transcript in order to transfer your credits. If you don't care about your credits, you might be able to simply go to the new college without in transferring those old credits. But it's unfortunate that I mean, the U.S. Department of Education has affirmed the college's authority to withhold academic transcripts, and unfortunately, there's not a lot that can be done.
Mark, let me add that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Deb. Let me add that I would also suggest the student be in touch with the financial aid office or the college business office to see if they can work out some type of repayment arrangements. Many colleges are willing to do so under specific circumstances.
Great. Question that I think we addressed this in the webinar, but just to reiterate, for a transgender student who has legally transitioned, which gender do they identify as?
It's currently the gender that was on their original birth certificate, recognizing that there are some states now where you can amend your birth certificate. The status, the gender that was originally listed on your birth certificate is the one that matters for selective service registration. There has been a lawsuit against the selective service registration requirement because it discriminates against men in favor of women or vice versa. The court did find that it was unconstitutional because women can serve in the U.S. military, but it is unclear what's going to happen with it, whether Congress will open up selective service to everybody or whether they will end selective service registration. But so far, nothing has happened.
Okay, interesting. Just another clarification. If a student is homeless and accompanied by their parents, would somebody still select yes on the FAFSA question about homelessness?
Well, the question is very specific that you must be an unaccompanied homeless youth or at risk of homelessness and unaccompanied. But it's still worth letting the college know that you are homeless so that they can maybe make other adjustments to the financial aid package to accommodate and also make you aware of the resources that the college provides.
Great. A question about, is the FAFSA used to determine financial aid at private colleges as well, or just public systems?
The FAFSA is used to determine eligibility for federal aid, state aid, and the college's own financial aid at all but 187 mostly private colleges. Those colleges still use the FAFSA for federal and state aid, but for their own financial aid, they use an alternate form called the CSS profile form. And those colleges, I mean, you can potentially ask for a waiver of, I mean, if they're asking for parent information and you're in foster youth, then you can ask for a waiver of that, and most cases the colleges will provide it so that you don't have to answer those questions. And similarly,
like there are like thousands of private colleges and universities in the country, right? So the vast majority are using the FAFSA.
Yeah, there's over 2,000 private colleges, so the vast majority are using the FAFSA. And also, there are a handful of public colleges that use the profile for their own financial aid funds. So on the college's website, see if they require the profile. That's an indication that they're using a supplemental form as opposed to the FAFSA for awarding their own financial aid funds.
Great.
Or the student can check the college, or the student can also check the cssprofile.org site. They do have a list of those colleges that do require the profile in addition to the FAFSA form.
Okay, great. So I know we're at time. So if for some reason we didn't get a chance to get to your question, please feel free to email us. I know there was a question about Cal Grant downloads, which is a too complicated a subject for this webinar, but if the person who asked that wants to email us directly, we can talk more about that. There also was a question about getting the contact information for the trainers on the webinar. So we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording, and that will come from Tia, and you will have her contact information when she sends that. So if there are any additional questions you have, feel free to reach out. We're happy to help you out in any way that we can. I want to thank Tia again, as well as Mark and David for being on the webinar this morning. And thank you all for sticking around and listening. So thank you very much, and this ends the webinar.